We'll go ahead and get started. So first off, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today for the Defend the Inflation Reduction Act, or as you'll hear it throughout the presentation, IRA for short, campaign call. This is our very first one, so thank you for joining us. We have a full agenda today, so I'll go ahead and get started. But before we begin, I want to first let you know that I have experts in the room with us today. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function on Zoom. You'll see a little button that says Q&A. Go ahead and type in your questions in there. I'll be screening from them throughout the presentation, and then we'll open up for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions throughout, feel free to put it there, or you can put it in the chat as well. I'll make sure to add them to the queue. At the very end, we'll also have time to unmute and ask questions. So if you prefer to say that, you can save your questions at the end, but don't forget them. If it helps, you can type them into the chat. But I'm going to introduce our speakers in a moment, but first let me go to the agenda. So we're going to talk about what the Inflation Reduction Act is, because they say 1 in 3 people have never heard of it. So in case you're one of those 1 in 3, we'll give a complete rundown of what the Inflation Reduction Act is, so you can know what's worth fighting for. Then we're going to talk about the current threats of the IRA, what the current status of our government is, and what does that mean for our climate funding and our environmental programs. Then we're going to talk about the DREAM.org approach, what our advocacy and legislative strategies are at the moment, and then how you can plug yourself into that, which will segue perfectly into our mobilization strategy and the different ways that you can help out, including a call-in day, spoiler alert, that's going to be happening next Tuesday, the 17th, that you can participate and volunteer in. So all of these will be covered throughout the presentation. So let me go ahead and introduce myself, and then I will pass it to Kyle, who will then pass it to Jackie. But my name is Tori Soriano. If we haven't met before, nice to meet you. I am the digital organizing manager here at DREAM.org. I use she, her pronouns. As I mentioned before, I'm based out in Las Vegas, Nevada. If you see all the emails and the petitions that go out for our green initiatives for climate justice, that's me. So nice to put a face to the name. And I am happy to be hosting this campaign call today. And I will pass it to our first guest speaker, Kyle.
Thanks, Tori. Hi, everybody. Great to be here with you today. Thanks for joining us. My name is Kyle Kameen. I am the policy director for Green for All here at DREAM.org. I use he, him pronouns. I am based in Washington, D.C., where I've been for the last 8 years. I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri, and still have a lot of family back there. My work primarily as policy director focuses on the legislative side of the House and how we are dealing with proposed legislation, existing legislation, et cetera. And you'll hear a bit about that from me today as we dive into the IRA. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. Jackie?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jackie Amos Holiday. I use she, her pronouns. I am the Climate Investments National Director for DREAM.org. What does that mean I do? It means that I work with federal agencies to make sure all of the inflation reduction funds as part of Justice 40, which is the initiative to ensure that at least 40% of the federal funds that are coming from these climate infrastructure bills actually reach and benefit marginalized communities. I am based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we have definitely been experiencing extreme heat this summer, as well as some flooding. I am in an environmental justice and historically marginalized community where I was born and raised and still live. And I am thrilled to be here today to discuss the Inflation Reduction Act with you all. Thank you.
No, thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Jackie. As I mentioned before, these are our experts in the room. Feel free to utilize their knowledge by asking them a bunch of questions. I'm just kidding, but use the Q&A function if you have any questions for them. But first, we're going to talk about what is the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of you may have joined in today not even knowing what this is. And some of you may have known and maybe have heard it in passing, but have not heard about it since. So I just want to get a sense of where everybody is at today. So I'm going to do a poll. And the poll is, how well do you know the Inflation Reduction Act? The questions can be, or the answers will be, I've never heard of it. And that's okay too. Like I mentioned before, 1 in 3 people have never heard of the Inflation Reduction Act. I may have heard of it announced, and that's about it. I kind of know the funding, there's funding in there, there's money somewhere, but I don't really know how it's going to be implemented. Fairly knowledgeable about it. Or you could be giving this lecture right now. You're an expert. So let us know in the poll how you think, or what you think you know about the Inflation Reduction Act, or how much you do know about it. Looks like we have a majority of people saying that they know that there's funding in it, and they don't know what it is or how it will be implemented. That's basically my level of knowledge too, I'll admit. All right. Yep, looks like that's our majority at 57%. Well, that's great to know, because we have Jackie who is going to break it down on what our climate investments are and exactly what the Inflation Reduction Act means. So I'll pass it to Jackie.
Perfect. So I am going to do very top line, and as questions come in, will answer them. But top line, the Inflation Reduction Act is this historical moment in time. It was passed in 2022, and it provides $369 billion in energy security and climate programs. What is energy security? You may ask. If you think about where we are in terms of this moment in time and energy and reducing our reliance on fossil fuel, that means that we have to have alternatives. And what do those alternatives look like? They look like wind, they look like solar, they look like hydro. They look like hydrogen for some, they look like nuclear. So there's a lot of different options to our reliance on fossil fuel that are out there, in addition to climate programs. So how do we build climate adaptation and climate mitigation as we solve for climate change, which is happening, right? And we are trying to reduce that. And how is this $360 billion being divided up? $270 billion is via tax incentives, because a lot of this Inflation Reduction Fund money is meant to encourage the private sector to enter into the energy security and climate programs. Why? Because we know that despite this being a momentous time in history, and $360 billion, trust me, is a lot of money, it's a lot of money, right? It's still not enough to get us to where we need to make sure that across the United States of America, that communities are protected. And infrastructure is updated to take us into what will be climate change. Even if we slow down climate change will still happen. So $270 billion via tax incentives, and $40 billion for environmental justice communities. And what has that impact been, and what does that impact will be? So again, 9 million climate jobs in the next decade. And the Inflation Reduction Act does have a 10-year spend down. So in the next 10 years, all this is projected to happen. It's happened rapidly, right? But we are realizing, particularly, and I think as I saw some of the comments in there, most folks have been some way, in some shape or form, impacted by climate change, be it flooding, be it rising temperatures, be it more extreme winters. We all are experiencing the impact of climate change, right? So this needs to happen rapidly, and that's why it is happening rapidly, and that's why folks from all across the sectors will call this moment very historic. And it also is to catalyze over $600 billion in private investment in clean energy. Because when we think of both like the research and the technology that needs to happen, the building up of the grids, right? The power grids that actually keep all of us powered. When we think about the transition to electric vehicles, and electric vehicles as in individual cars, but also like buses, truck fleets, and eventually there's a lot of some interesting stuff happening in the aviation space. That is a lot of investment that needs to happen, and a lot of grid updating so that we don't actually shut down the whole grid. And when I say grid, that whole power grid that all keeps us, if you live in an older community, you know those power lines that exist in front of your house, like, right? And we know when they go down, because if you've had an extreme weather event, be it like a storm, a hurricane, etc., you realize how disruptive it can be. And if you live particularly in a historically marginalized community, you realize that we are some of the folks that are most vulnerable to these events happening in our community. And there's also a goal to cut emissions by 40% by 2030. Why do we have to cut emissions by 2030? Because we actually do want to reduce climate change and really kind of achieve that 1.5 degree temperature change, then we have to meet these climate goals, and they are pretty aggressive. They're still not enough, but it gets us closer there, and it starts to build this mindset both in the public and the private sector, which is the important thing about the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide, Tori. And so what are the major funding categories? Again, clean energy deployment. And so there's $48 billion for that. So think rooftop solar. And rooftop solar is traditionally with like the single family home, but also community solar, because there's this understanding that when you think about rooftop solar and single family homes, you are ignoring a great percentage of the population, particularly marginalized communities who don't live in single family homes and are renters, right? Folks who live in multifamily units. So how do we actually make solar accessible to a wide variety of communities, right? And part of that is thinking about community solar. So how are we creating spaces that have solar panels that can be accessible for communities? And doing them in ways that are very inclusive of communities and what their needs and wants are. Energy efficient homes and buildings. So you think like heat pumps, and there's a lot of state legislation happening around like heat pumps, and people sometimes have very visceral reactions to abandoning natural gas and thinking of alternative ways to both cook their foods, but also heat their homes, right? And doing it in ways that is affordable for housing, but then also, again, thinking about like renters and tenants, right? And folks who actually don't own their homes. How can we make it actually more accessible for the middle-sized landlords, and thinking about larger scale development projects? Air pollution reduction, right? Like you think about air pollution and monitoring, and how are we also making sure that the air we breathe, which in some states, for instance, I'm in Pennsylvania, is considered a right, which is embodied in the Pennsylvania state constitution. How are we making sure that we're breathing safer air? Community transformation. Again, how are we changing communities in ways that are more environmentally sustainable? Neighborhood reconnection. And again, climate mitigation and resilience. So you think about, particularly if you are in a coastal city and you think about the amount of flooding that has happened, but even if you're not in a coastal city, I'm in Pittsburgh, we have 3 rivers, and we still experience a lot of flooding for a variety of reasons, right? And there are ways that you can both build natural barriers, and also artificial barriers that keep, again, communities safe, prevent those wet basements that if you live in an older home, you're probably experiencing right now. And again, thinking about like agriculture and conservation. How are we doing climate smart farming, and how are we preserving like the forest and actually building up the urban canopy and rural canopy and making sure that we preserve those? Because one thing we know is that trees actually help mitigate against climate change, and also help with preventing like the flooding, and also reducing the temperature, particularly like in urban environments. Next slide, Tori.
Ooh. Sorry, Jackie, I accidentally unmuted you or muted you.
That's okay, no worries. I'm going to pass the baton to Kyle right now, who will talk about the current threat.
Thanks, Jackie, for that great summary of the IRA. Appreciate you and the important work your team is doing with the agencies on the implementation side. Hello, everyone. And I know you have probably been hearing a lot about the current state of Congress in the news lately. I will not dive into the minutia here, but I will try to give you kind of an update so that it lays the groundwork for why we're having this call today and the threats that we see to the IRA investments. So As we approached the October 1st government shutdown deadline, Congress reached a deal to continue funding the government until November 17th, while they continued to try and create a budget for 2024. The reason October 1st was the date at which the government would shut down is because that's the end of the government's fiscal year and the start of its new fiscal year. So they'd have no more funding appropriated or set aside by Congress for 2024. So by creating this agreement, they bought themselves 45 days of time for the House and Senate to negotiate, iron out their differences, and create a budget agreement for 2024. Subsequently, and due in part to that agreement, some Republicans in the House moved to remove the Speaker, which needs to be in place to lead all House activities from his position, and they succeeded, which is the first time in history any such event has taken place. So at the moment, the House cannot operate without a speaker and is essentially frozen until such time as they elect a new speaker. And it is not clear of when that will happen. When they do return to business, government funding and the budget for 2024 will be a top priority. For our purposes today, the differences that led to that initial risk of a shutdown are our focus. The House budget proposal for 2024 cuts funding by more than $100 billion to essential agencies who are putting the IRA into action. So essentially, once the IRA was passed, it left to agencies to figure out, okay, here's what we need to accomplish. How are we going to do so? How are we going to implement it? And those agencies are now doing so. So they're cutting funding by about $100 billion. That level of funding would severely impact the ability of those agencies not only to implement the IRA, but also to do their other essential daily work. Additionally, their budget proposals specifically eliminate some funds that were passed as a part of the IRA, such as climate smart agricultural money and others. The Senate proposals for 2024 budgets do not. So understanding that there will be a negotiation between the two and the vulnerability of these funds, we're taking action to ensure that they're not on the table in negotiations. So what are we doing as an organization? We're speaking with legislators and their staff, educating them on the importance and impact of the IRA, and communicating the need to keep the legislation in place. We're making them aware of the threats to these programs and the risk associated with their cuts. We're coordinating with allies and keeping a close eye on the process, and budget proposals are evolving so that we can take additional action if necessary. So speaking of allies, I'm going to pass it back to Jackie so she can discuss the partnerships and coalitions work that's a piece of all of this.
Hi, everybody. So we have a very intersectional approach to all the work that we do at dream.org. In particular, the work of my team, the climate investments team, involves a lot of different angles. One is administrative reform. So when you think about the federal agencies who will be implementing the Inflation Reduction Act, some of which are Department of Transportation, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, all of those put out requests for public comment in regards to various administrative policies of how the funds will be distributed. So we are actively engaged in those conversations to provide them feedback and also hold them accountable. So hold their feet to the fire in terms of making sure the executive summary, of which I mentioned previously, Justice 40, is implemented in a transparent and equitable way that ensures that those funds actually do access and reach marginalized communities. So we are actively engaged in those conversations, and part of our process in ensuring that those administrative conversations happen is that we also engage communities on the ground, right? And find out what are their pain points, what are their pressure points, right? In terms of accessing that capital and accessing that information. And again, Kyle has also referenced the legislative advocacy that happens within our organization to make sure that from a legislative front that the current funds that are allocated are indeed distributed and appropriated, but also just making sure that there aren't additional legislations that become available that impede the flow of funds. In addition, we do a lot of mobilization and awareness. So that is just having conversations with the communities on the ground, which we call our transformative communities, about how to position themselves to make sure that they are ready to receive those funds, and also understand and are directly and full front and center in terms of what projects they would like to see in their communities and what the timeline is to have those projects built. So that's planning support and technical assistance, and also just bridge building, right? To a lot of folks, the federal government may seem, I mean, rightly so, right? Completely disconnected from what our real lived experiences are. But the reality is that, like, the policies that those folks create, as dysfunctional as they may be, impact all of us in our day-to-day lived reality and existence, right? And so the exercise of bridge building, the exercise of bringing folks to the federal government, right? They tax us regularly and often, right? We have to hold them accountable. We have to hold their foot to the fire. And the reality is that the climate is changing, right? And we are all being impacted, but we are not all being impacted the same. And it is imperative that marginalized communities and the issues and concerns that they face, both historically and currently, are part and front and center of these conversations. And so that is so much of what our work is. It is both reaching with communities, talking to them, and making sure that their issues and concerns are elevated, but also making sure that we are holding the federal government accountable to what they said they were going to do, and also making sure they understand that what communities need in order to access the funds, to make sure projects are executed, everything from understanding the permitting process and what permitting reform may look like, to making sure that the funds that have already been passed into law actually reach those communities in ways that benefit those communities and build wealth. Next slide.
So Jackie, you segued very perfectly to this slide right here, because in all honesty, that the communities are who needs to be at this, front and center for this dialogue, for these conversations. Our Congress, they are elected by us. And so they want to hear from constituents like you. And so I want to present ideas, or present the ways that you can join the fight to help protect these climate funds, to make sure that these investments reach your community and fit the needs of your community in terms of climate change, building climate resiliency, climate recovery. And so a big part of our mobilization strategy is actually making sure that you have those opportunities to have your voice heard and to help protect the funds that are needed for our communities for climate change. So I'm going to present multiple ways on how you can get involved, and don't worry about keeping track of all of them. I will send a follow-up email with the ways that you can plug in, but the first way is just signing our petition. I'm going to post it in the chat right now in case you haven't seen my email and you haven't already signed our Defend the IRA petition. This is sent directly to your elected officials, demanding them to protect our climate funds at all costs. So feel free to sign there if you haven't already. Another way to plug yourself in is to share your climate impact story. We had a few people that have already done it. We've had several stories be sent in, and I want to give a huge shout out to Amy, who's here today on this campaign call. And we also have Linda and Susan. I don't know if you guys are in the chat or not, but we've had several storytellers come in and not only amplify their own voice, but to expand it by setting up an interview with us so we can highlight your story to our elected officials and to our member base to get them more involved in this fight. So thank you so much for contributing. And if you haven't already, feel free to share your climate impact story with us. And you might be thinking, Tori, I don't really have a story to tell. Your story can be anything from your observations to your experiences, to your narratives, what your community is experiencing. Anything that is impacting you is a story. And your elected officials may not even be aware that this is happening in their own area, in your own neighborhoods. And so I invite you to share your climate impact story. And if you feel brave enough, feel free to set an interview with me to expand upon it so we can share it out and let people know what you are experiencing to create empathy, to advocate for action, and to hopefully get our elected officials to be more serious about protecting our climate funds. So I will post that here. There we go. The next way that you can get involved is our upcoming Pollen Day. So next Tuesday, exactly a week from today, we're going to be doing a Defend the Inflation Reduction Act Call-in Day. What this means is we're going to be making phone calls to our House representatives pretty much the entire day. All you have to do is we'll provide you a phone number or a keyword to text in that will hook you up to a line that will connect you directly to your representative. And then all you have to do is leave a voicemail telling them to protect climate funding, environmental programs, and agencies at all costs. Do not defund our planet. It's a real simple act. I will be, I'll post in the chat for you to sign up to join the call-in day. If you sign up, then I will text you the call-in number or keyword that day to participate in the call-in day. So make sure to sign up. Once again, I will send all of this out after the call. And it's real quick. You just leave a quick voicemail. Shouldn't take very long. Feel free to share that out to friends and family. The more people we have to participate in this call-in day, the bigger the impact we have, so that when the House is back in action, they will know for a fact that climate cannot be defunded. But if you want to play even a bigger role in next week's call-in day, I have another opportunity for you. So we are taking volunteers for the call-in day, and what that means is we have a large group of supporters and members in dream.org. We'll be sending out text messages to them to get them to be plugged in directly into the call-in day. So if you are interested in helping out and sending text messages, I ask you to set up a 30-minute phone call with or Zoom meeting with me, where I will train you on how to send text messages out. And then on the day of, you'll just spend maybe like 15 minutes or less sending out those text messages and amplifying our action out to millions, or not millions, of hundreds of people. So you might be thinking that, that's a simple act, just sending text messages, what will that do? But with your help, you will exponentially help reach the exponentially expand our reach out to our members. And like I said, the bigger we have, the more people that participate, the bigger the impact we have, the bigger the statement we can make, and the bigger our closer we get to our goal of protecting our funds. And so I invite you, if you're interested, to volunteer for the call-in day, just sending simple text messages. I will post the sign up on here, but once again, I will send all these links because it's kind of link fatigue right now. But I will send all of these in the chat or in a follow-up email. But that's all I have for today. Thank you everybody for participating, and thank you for tuning in to defend our climate funding and our climate programs. Before we leave, I will open it up for questions for our lovely speakers. And it looks like we have a question about the slides will be available after the call. These slides will be available. I will make sure to send them out in a follow-up email so you can have them. Also, if Kyle and Jackie, if you guys are okay, feel free if you want to put your emails in the chat. If anybody has any further questions, they can message you if that's okay.
So I had a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so my question was that, we are hearing repeatedly that the IRA has a very complex process of finally disbursing funds for the projects that have been kind of identified for this. And so what is going to happen is that for perhaps an additional, and this was even covered by the recent New York Times article, that for up until November next year, as a matter of fact, a lot of the funds would not have come and a lot of complications would have, however, emerged, such that the average voter will actually feel very alienated by the IRA and will feel that, this isn't working. It was bogus. So how do we kind of like, what are the success stories of IRA that we can amplify and kind of beat this narrative, which is currently, being projected against it?
Well, I think I'll take that and then I can pass the baton to Kyle. But I think first and foremost is educating people that the Inflation Reduction Act is a thing that exists. I mean, we know what the polling data says, and most people don't even know that it's a thing, let alone know it's something to be alienated about. And then I will add to the second point of that is as the green banks, the National Green Bank gets established under the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, as those projects become on the pipeline, and as soon as that award date happens in the early part of next year, they will be looking, and they are currently looking for projects that are shovel ready within 6 months of the award date, right? And so we need to make sure that those projects are showcased and amplified, but also that we get additional projects in the pipeline, which is one of the most important reasons that awareness and amplification of like the process to get in and really utilizing the TICTACs, which are the technical assistance programs that the federal government has created to help get more projects in the pipeline. But key to that is also providing the federal government feedback around those TICTACs and if they're actually are doing their job of helping folks to both fill out the application and remove obstacles and barriers for both governments and communities. When I say governments, I mean like state and local governments to access those funds. And in addition, anytime a project is actually funded via inflation reduction funds and CHIPS funding, bipartisan infrastructure funds, we have to acknowledge that, right? Like there's a lot of ribbon cuttings, but folks don't actually realize the pathway to those funds becoming existing. Kyle, I'll pass it.
Yeah, and kind of stepping back from the process and looking at it in more of like a macro political language lens, the challenge is that, to use maybe an overworked analogy, you're building the plane while you're flying it. This is, historic legislation in a number of ways and is asking agencies in many cases to do things that they've never done with more money than they've ever had. And so, from a timeline perspective, they're both trying to hire the people that are going to implement these programs and implement them and design them at the same time. And so, part of what we can do as Dream.org as an organization and you all can do is help identify the choke points that are happening. And we can look for, whether it's Jackie's work with agencies or my work on the legislative side, opportunities to help improve the legislation and the process along the way. But that is definitely going to be a challenge with a piece of legislation this big, this new in concept in many ways, and asking agencies to do things that they've never done. There are going to be challenges, but I think that goes along with saying that it just takes time to implement something large to begin with. I think we have a hand up as well.
Yeah, I was just making sure that they answered your question. Or did you? Perfect. All right. I will allow Bakura to ask her question.
I don't necessarily have a question. It was a response to the young lady who had just made the wonderful comment. I received, first of all, I represent a small grassroots organization that's in environmental space, and the majority, and I'm also in other areas, but most of us do not even grapple with applying for federal or state funding. I did my first federal grant this year and actually got it. And the process was so daunting. Not only applying, but after winning it, it was absolutely the red tape is absolutely ridiculous. And so when you're dealing with marginalized communities, I want to, say that we have to be responsible. The government needs to be responsible. If they have never done this thing before and we're doing the thing and we don't know how to do it, then ask the folks who could. Leaving us out of these conversations, but saying, oh, we want to give you all access to money, but you don't want to give us access to how to implement this to best serve our communities, it's asinine. And my grant money came down through it was the EPA through Chesapeake Bay program, and it was a pass through. And it's just absolutely ridiculous. And I told him, I said, listen, I need to speak to somebody higher up so you all can get this process together. You need to have an orientation for newcomers coming in, and you need to have us all doing the paperwork at one time. There needs to be, your servicer. I'm calling them a servicer, but it's that's not what they call her. But if they're not available because they got 350 other grants that they're managing, and we're on a timeline. Like, I am behind in my grant 2 months because the federal government doesn't have a process, but they're still expecting me to do what I said that I was going to do in my grant, and they haven't expended a dime yet. And so small organizations are not going to be able to operate within that realm. And they should have thought about this, and they would have known this had they engaged with small organizations, especially those that say that we're not dealing with y'all money. We're not dealing with y'all because of this exactly right here. And if we're ever going to reach our goal, it's going to take all of us. But if some of our organizations that said, I'm just strictly not dealing with the federal government, that is still a disadvantage to our communities, because these orgs are doing great work. And so there has to be other ways to get funding to organizations outside of the grant process, period. So that's my little 2 cents.
Yeah, it's not your 2 cents. That's $100 right there. And I'm so
come on.
and you spoke no lies whatsoever, because I think even with like medium and large size organization, it's not easy. It is not easy to receive and or manage a grant from the federal government, right? And I think that they are hearing that, right? Again, I think to put on to Kyle's point, right, that now they have much more money than they've ever had before, and they are charged with making sure that money benefits like marginalized communities. And I think it's important that we keep on speaking up and speaking out, but we also understand that there's other things in terms of like the government prizes, right? Like there are other ways that the government is trying to think of to distribute it money, right? And to do it in a way that has like accountability, because it is tax dollars, and with tax dollars comes a lot of red tape. But how do you make that process easier and more transparent while still having accountability for tax dollars for small organizations that, to be honest, really are doing the work, right? Like it is the small organizations that know communities, right? Know what their needs are and are probably the most nimblest to be able to respond to those immediate needs in ways that are both accessible and culturally competent to specific communities. So I agree with you that. I agree with you 100%. I think that it is imperative that we keep speaking up and speaking out. And when you, and I put my email in the chat, when you have specific pressure points, like elevate them and amplify them over and over again, because we got to get this right, right? Because at the end of the day, it is our communities that suffer when we don't get it right. And the federal government has a responsibility to ensure that the most vulnerable amongst us are protected as the climate changes.
And
so everything you said.
Yeah, and all I'll add, Jackie, is your team has been doing work focused directly on this, and hosted a great panel 2 weeks ago now, was it, at the National Press Club, and that was speaking directly about some of these challenges and about other opportunities for funding and how do we kind of stack funding and provide greater access. So I think that could be a resource as well that we might be able to share the link to the recording of. I can track it down and drop it in the chat as well, but definitely something that your team is working on.
Yeah, and then I would just also add, I think it is also imperative, and I think this is what Inflation Action is meant to do and is starting to do, is making sure that the private sector is doing its part and its role too, in terms of making sure that we are leveraging these public funds for private capital dollars, right? And really making sure that we are amplifying this dialogue in terms of every project, right? Like when you think of like private investors, right? Some of them are looking for the big projects, like the $50 million project, the $100 million, the $2 million project. But there are projects that can be done for under $1 million, for under $5 million, that have a lot of significant impact in like marginalized community. And that part of my team's work is making sure that those conversations are amplified and that they are seeing the need, right, in terms of like their investment, to make sure that they are targeting small community organizations and groups as well, and community-based organizations. So I welcome as many folks who want to kind of join me in amplifying that dialogue as well. Again, feel free to reach out and email me.
Yeah, and I'm going to post this in the chat. This is our dream.org member Slack. A lot of these conversations happen along our member Slack as well. So if you're not a member, feel free to jump in. We have a lot of organizers, campaigners that are doing a great work out here. And we try to amplify some of the opportunities that are available for folks to plug into. We also have the Green Spotlight, which is through our coworker, our colleague Brenda. She puts this out to kind of give light of like funding opportunities, technical assistance, help, videos, and trainings that are offered for nonprofits and community-based organizations to kind of get involved in. So if you're interested in that, join the member Slack to have these conversations with like-minded folks who are doing great work out there. We'll try to amplify some of the opportunities there, but reach out to any of us. You'll have my email because I'll send a follow-up email with all of these information, including the recording that you're going to provide, Kyle. I'll add that to the email. But feel free to reach out to any of us if you are interested in these opportunities. You want to learn more how to, get the help that you need to get access to these funds. Because as everyone's echoing that, we're hearing that that is a huge thing that's been going on. Yeah, I'm looking in the chat, making sure there are no other questions. Yeah, I'll make sure to put all the emails and links in that email as well. So I'll make sure that you'll have access to that.
Jacqueline Hairston just posted something, another issue, but I did not understand what she's referring to.
See if I can read it. Another issue is having experts who cannot be paid and have to assist grassroots organizations to prepare through in-kind services. I am doing this work in marginalized communities through my pension donation. I don't know if you want to come off mute, Dr. Jacqueline Hairston, and talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing or what you put into the chat. That's fine, no worries. Does anyone want to talk about
I just speak to Dr. Jacqueline's comment or question. I what I believe she, I'm assuming her pronouns as well, may be referring to is the technical assistance to get grants written. I'm assuming that is what she is asking about. Oh, she can't unmute. Can we unmute her on your end?
Let me try unmuting.
Okay.
You can see if that button unmutes you. If not, then no worries. We can maintain contact in the chat, but Jackie, you can continue.
And I was gonna say, I'm assuming that's what you, and put in the chat if I am on point in terms of what I said. Or are you talking about in the implementation portion? You can just write yes or no. Still won't let her unmute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Either way, that is a major pain point for folks. That the have you engaged with the federal tick tax at all? Yeah, you've been helping organizations get ready and explain kind of what get ready in terms of getting on sam.gov, in terms of actually like the grant writing, in terms of the prizes, or in terms of like the DOE loan applications. Okay, you've been waiting for connection with the Tic Tacs. And what region are you in? What EPA region? Do you know? All right, you're in the southeast, so that could be. Oh, in Florida. Florida is an interesting state in terms of IRA implementation, right? Because the governor doesn't want it. Yes, yeah. I'm very familiar with Florida. Let's schedule some time to like chat. For the folks who don't know what the Tic Tacs are, those are actually in the various EPA regions. So the EPA is broken into various regions. Like the West Coast, a lot of that is like 9. Appalachia, a lot of that is like 4, and there's a lot of other different regions across the country. And each region is assigned a Tic Tac, which is like a technical assistance entity that is supposed to help folks, particularly applying for funding from the Environmental Protection Agency with like their application process. And as the current state exists, and again, similar to the analogy that Kyle presented as building the plane as you fly it, there have been a lot of issues with the Tic Tacs and with like the rollout, right? And one of the things that my team has been doing is collecting feedback from CBOs, so community-based organizations, and giving it to the EPA in terms of what are some of the pain points in accessing the Tic Tacs that smaller groups have been experiencing, and solutioning for ways to kind of overcome that so that organizations can actually get their applications submitted in a timely way, in ways that aren't overly burdensome, particularly for organizations that don't have the staff or the capacity to do a lot of the technical ask. So I hear that.
Looks like we have another question in the chat. This might be for you, Kyle. How might the capture of the Supreme Court affect any implementation of the IRA projects?
It's a bit of a difficult question to answer. I think some of it's going to depend on, you know, which cases the Supreme Court grants cert to, and you know, puts on their docket is what that means for those. Sorry to use lingo or jargon, but essentially, you know, I think that the court is you know, a bit hostile to agency actions that they don't feel are specifically empowered by legislation. But I'll say that the IRA is often pretty specific about the actions it wants agencies to take and the programs it wants agencies to create. So I think that there is some risk there, but probably not in the near term, and that the greater risk is around funding. There's more, I would say, funding and political risk than there is judicial risk at this moment. But I would also I'm open to Jackie's thoughts as well if she wants to push back on that.
No, the probably the thing that I would say the most is like the 2 threats that I see, or not even really threats. I think one was thought out in terms of by the Biden administration, which is like race, right? The current Supreme Court is very hostile to anything that is race-based, right? And that is why Biden and like Justice 40 and the environmental justice tools have been rather race agnostic in terms of like what qualifies as like an environmental justice community, right? And we can push back because we all know that race impacts everybody's lived experience. But we also realize the current kind of political environment that we exist in. And then like the second thing, and I think Kyle kind of like alluded to that a little bit, is just the Supreme Court's animosity to what they perceive as the overreaching behavior of federal agencies, particularly think of like EPA and some of like their regulatory power, but those rulings could have long-term impact on other federal agencies. So that's the only probably thing. Those are all the only potential threats I can think of.
Yeah, I completely agree on the race piece, Jackie. And actually, in retrospect, the administration looks pretty prescient that they were kind of ahead of that ruling, thinking about how to design these. So, for one reason or another.
All right, Kimmy, you're up for your next question or next question.
I don't know if like this is this like transfers over, but I had trouble getting an appointment with my PTAC. So that's a procurement technical assistance program. And then I found out that there is another agency that has PTAC capability, but they're not a standalone PTAC. So I applied because I was in a PTAC area, so I was supposed to go to my PTAC, but I applied for a waiver to go to this PTAC instead, because they're great, and my PTAC people, they were not great. They were very difficult. And then I ended up with this other agency that is it's not a PTAC agency, but they have PTAC capability. So they call them now Apex Accelerators. They're not called PTACs anymore. But I'm just throwing that out there in case, anybody wants to look around and see if it's possible to get assistance from like a different kind of agency that's, whatever.
And maybe Tori, just let me know, maybe as a follow-up kind of to this call, we could just send out a one pager. My team could put it together in terms of assistance opportunities for small CBOs from like the federal government.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, let's add it to the list. I'll send out a follow-up email today with all the information that was presented today. Once you get that one pager up, I'll share it out. But we have about 3 minutes till we wrap up. Does anyone have any last lingering questions? If not, we can at least give some snaps and claps to our lovely guest speakers, Jackie and Kyle, for being so informative and providing so much information for us. Thank you guys so much for coming out today. I will make sure that all of their contact information is shared in the email. If you want more information or you want to get plugged in, and feel free to send us your questions or concerns about federal funding and your concerns about the government, because this is what we're here for. This is Dreams.org's work to expand these monies to you and your communities. This will not be our only Defend the IRA campaign call. This is just our first. So I'll make sure to plug you in with our next one so you can be updated on our climate funding. But thank you for tuning in. Look out for my email to join in for our opportunities that are happening next week. And enjoy your Tuesday.